and welcome to the Bible for Worship on this 25th Sunday after Pentecost, when our gospel reading is written in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. Jesus told another parable. For it's as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to their ability. Then he went away. At once, the one who had received the 5 talents went off and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I've made 5 more talents. The master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. The master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But the master replied, You wicked and fearful slave. You knew, did I, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This parable, this frankly somewhat troubling parable on its surface, is the next to last in a series of parables, a series of Jesus' teachings, which occupy all of chapters 24 and 25 in Matthew's Gospel. The series opens in the first 2 verses of chapter 24 with Jesus pointing to the temple in Jerusalem and predicting its destruction. For Matthew's community, that's a destruction that they have already seen. When the Romans leveled the temple, burned it to the ground, and destroyed the city of Jerusalem in the year 70 of the 1st century. For Matthew's community, that experience of watching God's temple in Jerusalem destroyed probably felt like the beginning of the end. And so these 2 chapters in Matthew's Gospel, 24 and 25, all focus on the end and how the community should be prepared to meet that end when it comes. The parables that precede this one in chapters 24 and 25, and the teachings, even the ones that are not parables, focus First of all, on the suddenness of the coming of the Son of Man, the coming of the end. You cannot know, not even the angels in heaven know when that will happen. Chapter 24, verses 36 to 44 embody that awareness and that caution about the suddenness of how the end will come. And then the parable of the faithful and wicked servants in the last verses of chapter 24, verses 45 to 51, talk about the importance of faithfulness as one waits for the end, as the end is delayed, as the coming time stretches out and is uncertain. That faithfulness and steadiness with what Jesus has taught is essential to meeting that end time well. And then in the story of the wise and foolish wedding attendants, at the beginning of chapter 25, right before this parable, both of those themes are emphasized: the suddenness and unexpectedness with which the end will come, and the key of faithfulness and steadiness in the waiting. And so here, as we come to this parable of the talents, as it's been called, we've been prepared to think about the end and to learn something perhaps more about what it requires of the community. Not only suddenness, not only faithfulness, but perhaps something more. And indeed, in this parable, the suddenness of the coming is really not emphasized at all. The master gives the talents to the three slaves, goes off, and after a long time returns. But it's not as though that return is so dreadfully unexpected or sudden. There's no emphasis of that there. Here, there is clearly an emphasis still on the faithfulness. What will the slaves do on behalf of the master during the time that the master is away? And of course, in Matthew's community, this is somewhat or even fully allegorical. This is about Jesus, the master, and the delay in Jesus' return. The temple had fallen a decade or perhaps as much as two before Matthew's community would be reading this gospel. And so, if that was the beginning of the end, what is the deal with the master's return being so delayed? And here, that delay, represented as a long time, calls on the three servants or slaves to exercise their own abilities, their own capacities, their own talents, quite literally, on behalf of the master. And the distinction here between those who do that well and the one who does not do that well emerges in verses 25 and 26 in the word fear. The slave who does not return double to the master says, I was afraid. And the master, in responding, in accusing the slave of not being productive, says, you fearful slave. It's a matter of being paralyzed by fear that Matthew here cautions against. And so in these three parables, we can see that there is an awareness of how we should live in this meantime between Jesus' death and resurrection and the day when Jesus will return. And Matthew knows, believes, that that return will involve a judgment. And the judgment will depend on how it is that we have conducted ourselves in the meantime. That is not a central theme for Lutheran theology, certainly, to focus on the judgment and the possibility of being cast into the outer darkness. Lutheran theology draws its central emphases on grace from other parts of the New Testament. And yet, even though that is not a central image for Lutherans and for other Christians who emphasize God's graciousness, God's forgiveness, nevertheless, this parable and Matthew's contribution to the gospel message can be an indication of the urgency of what a difference it can make how we live in this meantime. Unlike the unfaithful slave, the wicked slave in the parable, we should not be arrogant and begin to take things into our own hands and, as it says there, beat the other slaves. Arrogance is not the way to behave in the meantime. And as with the wise and foolish wedding attendants, the foolish ones were disregarding of the moment. They lost sight of the fact that the meantime would end and the Lord would come back, the bridegroom would appear. They were distracted. They literally fell asleep in the parable. So being sort of out of it or disregarding of this reality is not the way to live in the meantime either. And here, with regard to the servant with one talent, we ought not be paralyzed with fear. Not arrogant, not disregarding, and not paralyzed. None of those are the way for us to live in this meantime, but rather to remain faithful to Jesus' calling and to Jesus' teaching. The teaching, the very first teaching with which Matthew started off this gospel, is the Sermon on the Mount. And the very last parable that Jesus will tell next after this one, before embarking on his journey into Jerusalem for his final week, that is about the sheep and the goats. And how is it that the Sermon on the Mount and the image of the judgment of the sheep and the goats shapes our faithful life? It's about caring for the least of these Jesus brothers and sisters. For in doing that, we care for Jesus himself. But that awaits next week's reading. That awaits further commentary. For now, we have learned that in this meantime in which we also live, neither arrogance about our position, nor a disregard that loses sight of the goal, nor a paralyzing fear in the face of all that's going on around us, constitutes faithfulness. It is faithfulness to God's promise and Jesus' teaching that will carry us through this meantime to the end. God bless.